Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. And we're going to go right into the screen share. And let me do this. Let me see what I can do here. There we go. Okay, so here we are. We're actually in a very significant part of Exodus. This is Parshat Mishpatim. It means statutes. And of course, it's the Parsha that follows the giving of the Ten Commandments. And this is an extremely rich source of Jewish law. And especially here, we're talking about, I guess we call it civil law, because we're talking about compensation. That's the way we're going to understand it, for injuries. So famous verse, and how the rabbis interpret this verse so that it doesn't mean literally what it says. Jewish tradition does not understand these verses in a literal sense. So ayin tachat ayin, that is eye in the place of an eye. Shein tachat shein, a tooth in the place of a tooth. Yad tachat yad, a hand in the place of a hand. Regel tachat ragel, a foot or a leg in the place of a leg. And I will go to the next verse because it continues. So what happened was we started before last year when we were doing this. We started with a section that started to deal with physical injuries, and that whole area of law involving physical injuries. And we are into the very center of it right now. The next verse, and by the way, you will see there's tons and tons of Torah T'mima on this particular parsha. So, kaviyah tachat kaviyah, a burning in the place of a burning. Petza tachat petza, an open wound in the place of an open wound. Chabura tachat chabura, a bruise in the place of a bruise. And maybe we should take just one peek at another one. All right, so that's basically the end of that little section. And now it simply talks about, it goes on with a particular situation of injury. So let's take a look now at the Rashi. So, ayin tachat ayin. So, simei ein chavero, if he blinded the eye of his neighbor, or noten lo demei eino, he has to pay him the compensation, the amount of money for his eye. And how do you base the compensation? Kama shifchato damav lim. I'm going to make sure I've got this. Limkor bashuk, right? So, in other words, how much would he be paid for now as a slave if he was sold in the marketplace? In other words, how much was he worth when he had both eyes, and how much is he worth now having lost one of those eyes? And that's how you figure out the actual value. Now, let me quickly go on to say this is not the only source of compensation in this case, and we will discuss it. But right now, it is the value. What they were thinking about is, how do you calculate the value of an eye itself? And this is the basis in which they were figuring the difference in value of an eye. V'chein kulam, and this applies to all of them. In other words, if in fact you injure his hand and he now is permanently disfigured because of his hand, how much less would he be worth, etc., etc. Okay, velo netilat ever mamash, and we're not necessarily talking about literally taking a limb. Okay? Kemo shedarshu rabotenu, as our rabbis explained, beperek hachovel, in the chapter called hachovel, the one who injures in Baba Kama. So there is clearly a discussion in Baba Kama, in the Talmud. It's, I suppose, relatively speaking, a famous discussion where they discuss the fact that the Torah does not mean this literally. And this is what he's saying. Rashi is saying it doesn't literally mean taking the other person's eye. In other words, you shouldn't think that because you took out someone's eye, they're going to take out your eye. I believe that's sort of lex talionis. And there's a real discussion there. I remember just a little bit of that discussion, a tiny bit. So one argument is, we understand that the Torah is based on justice. Justice is a foundation of it. So what happens in a case where for example, a person who is blind takes out the eye of another person? How do you apply this law? And they think of many cases where this law simply couldn't be applied. And from that's one of the ways they deduce that this is not to be interpreted literally. Going on, we're going to see some other things now. So, kvi'ah tachat kvi'ah, a burning in the place of a burning. Makot esh, in other words, we're talking about someone who has injured someone through burning, by burning them. The atachshav, up to this point, diber bechavala sheyesh ba pachat damim. And up to this point, in other words, in that previous verse, the Torah was speaking about a situation where a person is lessened in value in that sense because of that injury. But now, but now the Torah is talking about a situation where the person isn't worth any less as a human being, as if he was sold in the market. Elatzar, but what it's talking about now is pain and suffering. That's what it's talking about. In other words, the Torah is saying that in injuring someone else, one has, and in figuring out the compensation for that act, one also has to take into account pain and suffering. We will see it doesn't stop there. There are other issues as well that have to be taken into account in terms of figuring out the compensation. Kagon, so for example, Kava'o beshipud al tzipornav. What happens if he burned him with a metal spit on his fingernails? So, omdim kama adam keyotze bazeh. So one tries to figure out how much a person in this particular case, right, in such a case, rotze litol. In other words, how much would I have to pay you, or how much would I be willing how much would I feel I would need to be paid in order to allow someone to do that to me? In other words, how much would I figure it was worth to have my fingernails burnt by a metal spit? So that's how you figure this out. Lihiyot mitzta'er kach, to be pained in such a way. Going on, petza. So when it talks about petza, he maka hamotzi adam. We're talking here about a wound which lets out blood, right? An open wound. Shepatza et besaro. In other words, that he created a wound in his flesh. And this is a French word which I do not recognize, okay? But the Yiddish is an offene Wunde, which the German sounds awfully like the actual, excuse me, like the English. Hakol lefi ma shehu, right? According to the situation, im yesh bo petach damim. So here is a case where he might be pachat damim, that there may be a devaluation, noten nezek. In that case, he gives the compensation for, it's called nezek. That is the actual injury itself. The im nafal lemishkav, and now we're going to go to a third category of compensation, and if he had to be bedridden. If he was bedridden as a result of this injury, noten shevet, he has to pay now for his lack of work, his loss of income as a result of the fact that he has bedridden, very poor, and also his medical expenses. So we have the value, the value of the actual injury itself, and how much he's worth less now, the pain that he's had to go through. We are talking about the fact that he cannot go to work at all, so loss of time, as it were, and also medical expenses. So from these verses, we're able to deduce these four categories, right? Let's see. Uvoshet, and there's a fifth category, and that is humiliation. How much was he humiliated by being injured? Because it's also, of course, when you're injured, it is also a humiliating experience. V'tsar, umikra, right. Uvoshet utzar. So he's counting all these things, right? So, voshet, humiliation, v'tsar, and pain and suffering. Umikra ze, and this particular verse, yeterhu, it is actually not needed, right? Uva hachovel. So since it's not needed for the basic meaning of what's going on, uva hachovel, and in the chapter hachovel, the one who injures in the Talmud, darshuhu rabotenu, right? Our rabbis inferred from it, lechayev al hatzar, that it's coming to tell you that a person has to be paid for pain and suffering, afilu b'makom nezek, that it's coming to tell you that you have to pay him his pain and suffering, even in a place where he actually injured him physically. Here we go. Why? Why do we need to learn that? She'afal pi shenoten lo demei yado, because even despite the fact that he has paid him the value of his hand, ein potrin oto min hatzar, he is not excused, having paid for the injury itself and for his hand, so it's as if he has purchased his hand. He nevertheless isn't excused from the pain, lomar, to say. In other words, he might have wanted to argue v'kana yodeh, ho'il v'kana yodo. He might have wanted to argue and say, well, I paid for his hand. Yesh alav lechatechat, right? Looks like bechol ma sheyirtzeh, right? So in other words, this is a continuation of the argument, right? That since he's paid for his hand, it doesn't matter how he removed the hand, right? Ela, but they say, omrim lo, but they say, yesh lo lechatcha, right, to cut it off. So I'm going to read the Hebrew again, right? Yesh alav lechatcha b'chol ma sheyirtzeh. In other words, because he's paid for the hand itself, how he chose to remove the hand was totally up to the person who cut off the hand. But they say to him, Yesh lo lechatcha b'sam. He could have removed it with some kind of medication, she'eino mitzta'er, which wouldn't have caused him any pain, kolkach, which wouldn't have been so painful. And this person cut off his hand with metal, with a knife or something, and caused him additional pain. So they say that this, even though you could derive many of these categories of compensation from the previous verse, this verse comes to tell you that regardless, under all circumstances, he has to be compensated for pain and suffering. Chavura. So what about chavura? It could be that, in fact, he's simply talking about petza, right? The open wound, because, of course, if he cut off a limb or something like that, that certainly creates an open wound. So we're saying this comes to teach you about the pain and suffering. Kavura, that's a bruise. He maka shahadam nitzra. This is referring to a blow where the blood is collected in the wound, the eina yotze, but doesn't come out of the wound. It's not an open wound. Ella shema'adim habasar, but what it causes redness to the flesh. Kenegdo, in where it's been, where the smack has taken place. The lashon chavura, and this expression of chavura, it says, apparently, according to Sfaria, it's a French word, tash, belaz, and in the German, flocken, spots, or bruises, right? Kamo, and he says in Jeremiah, it says, venamer chavar verutav. There is the chabura here. And it's a verse in Jeremiah chapter 13 where he says, can the leopard change its spots? The Targumo, and the Targum, the Aramaic is mashkofi, right? Mashkofi actually means a bruises, right? So let's go back here to where the Targum is. We're on the next page. So here we go. Mashkofe. So we translate it as bruises, but it means smacks, more like that. Lashon chavata. So this mashkofe, this Aramaic word, is also used to translate a word chavata, which means a hit, a smack, right? Batudre, something like that, right? And the Yiddish is shlog. To shlog means to smack, to hit. Vechein, and likewise, the Aramaic translation of a verse is shtufut kadim. This is back in Exodus, I believe, where maybe it's referring to the dream of Pharaoh, where he saw the 7 ears of corn, shtufut kadim, smacked by the east wind. Shkifan kidum, right? So the translation is there. There's this word mashkof here. The m of mashkof is a utility letter here. So it means in Aramaic, shkifan, beaten, kidum, east wind. So we can see that there's a cognate here, kadim in Hebrew, kidum in Aramaic, chavutot baruach, in other words, smacked around by the wind. V'chein, and likewise, al hamashkof, the word when it talks about putting the blood on the lintel, the Hebrew word is mashkof, and there's the word again. The translation is going to be that this particular word, right? And the Hebrew itself is there, al shem shahadelet nokesh alav. And the reason it's called a lintel is because back then, when they made their doors, the door would basically smack against the lintel so that it wouldn't keep swinging. So this word chavura is translated as in an Aramaic word that means to smite, to smack. And I think this is a good place for us to leave things today. So we'll make up for yesterday's long lesson with a shorter lesson today. And this is a development of a specific case of the subject, and we'll set the mark for tomorrow in this particular place. Any comments before I stop the recording?
How do you evaluate pain?
Essentially, I think what they were saying is, how much would you be willing to suffer to have this done to you? I believe Rashi mentions that. In other words, you figure out how much people are willing to be compensated in order to go through such a procedure.
So it's up to the person that received the.
I think they possibly asked a number of people. I don't know that you can necessarily do that. I think Kiyotse Bazer, when Rashi used that term, I think he was saying that, you get a general sense of how much this would be. And of course, that could be a lot of money, right? To go through an injury that would create pain for you. People would probably want a lot of money for that, to have to suffer that particular injury.
Just think of Wittgenstein as a problem of pain. And
Right.
it's different for everybody.
Yes, it is, but you can get an average. And I think that's what he's saying, is you figure out, an average of how much people would want to be compensated. I mean, how else does one figure this out? And I think that's what he's saying when he says Kiyotse Baseh in a similar case. So, okay. But you're right. I mean, this is we're just really